Diana Garcia is a licensed mental health counselor in sunny Florida. She has her BA and her master's in psychology and is the founder of Nurturing Minds Counseling. This is where Diana helps people feel more calm, confident, more kick-ass, and helps couples build their bond. Diana is a proud first-generation Hispanic and is also a soon-to-be published author. Her book, Negative Thoughts Happen, How to Find Your Inner Ally When Your Inner Critic Shows Up, will be published this December. She's very active on Instagram and TikTok. Diana, we're so delighted to have you here. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks for having me. It's so funny to hear your own intro, but thank you. I'm excited to be here and have this conversation, especially since when we talked, I definitely thought we were just going all over the place, but we were so super excited to talk about this.
We had such a great intro conversation. It could have been a podcast in itself, so it's great that we're doing it again now. Diana, I'd love to dive a little bit more into your journey of how you became a therapist and what this whole space really means to you.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's funny because whenever anyone asks me, like, how did you become a therapy? It's funny because they struggled for a long time to answer that question. I think I needed to have like the perfect why, right? Like why I was a therapist. And you'll hear other therapists really talk about, you know, their history and working with a therapist or like just knowing this was their calling. And I didn't have that experience, which for a long time, like I said, I was like, oh gosh, am I in the right field? And through doing some of my own personal work, it really is kind of looking back. So like you said, I'm a first gen Hispanic here in South Florida, and kind of feelings, thinking, you know, talking about our feelings, our thoughts, kind of anything psychology oriented wasn't really a thing in my family. And not because my parents, you know, that just wasn't a thing in my culture. So I found myself when I got to undergrad, anything psychology related, I just was like a sponge, and I was so excited to learn about it, understand it, apply it. I was like, whoa, this is a thing. And I think that's, looking back now, I think I was trying to do some of my own personal work that I just really wasn't exposed to any of these concepts. And I just continued to thrive and wanting to learn more. And really the acknowledgement that if I really didn't know any of this, I'm pretty sure a lot of people in my culture generally also weren't raised with this awareness. So that's kind of really kind of full circle where I've kind of come to, that I really enjoy working with people who are like interested, motivated, usually even like first time people that are coming to therapy, a lot of first gens, if there's been like maybe stigma or hesitation, but they're finally kind of willing and ready to look at doing some of their own work.
It puts you in such a powerful position to be able to help other people as well who are in kind of this similar situation. If you have a family who's not interested in this self-exploration, if it's kind of stigmatized, then it can be very difficult to even reach out for help, even when deep down you know that you need it.
Yeah, and I actually hear that all the time. I hear that a lot with clients who, you know, they've been thinking about it for a while, they've thought about it. I mean, like even this acknowledgement that they've wanted to, but that there's been a lot of stigma. Or even now, if they are pursuing this decision to do therapy, it's like, well, I don't want my mom to know. Or if my dad knows, they ask me like, what's the point? You're not crazy. You don't need this. So there's still a lot of, I think, stigma in certain families of like pursuing your own work, and that it's like meaningless because you're fine. You don't really need this, or, you know, go seek spiritual support, or, you know, kind of just get over it. So I think, and I think that's why sometimes it takes a long time for people to take that courageous step. But I'm seeing that a lot more. And I wanted to attribute it to, I think now there's more kind of talk about mental health, and even mental health in like, you know, different types of communities, culture, Latinx community, that people start to feel a little bit more comfortable seeking those services.
What are some of the challenges that you see that first generation folks face that others do not?
Yeah, absolutely. I think really individually, it is like really a cultural identity journey, and starting to really, depending on if you're first gen or second gen, like starting to really get comfortable with what your identity is, and kind of feeling like you're a little bit split, but you don't really belong in any. So like this really common perspective, maybe you're more westernized if you grew up here, and maybe your parents or your parents' culture, your grandparents, it's a much different culture, and like that constant cultural clash. But that you're, again, like you understand one, and you even maybe identify with your parents or grandparents or your culture, but also heavily identify with being American or Canadian or whatever the case is. but there is like these minute culture clashes. So I'll just kind of give an example, even in my own life. So my name is actually, it's in Spanish, it's Diana. And I just remember when I was in kindergarten, when you go to school, it's English here. Obviously, I'm speaking English, but at home, everything was in Spanish. And I remember that when someone asked me to introduce myself, I remember, and I always think about this, like having such confusion about how to say my name. Do I say my name in Spanish? Do I say my name in English? And then I had a middle name that was also in Spanish. Do I add that, which is very common in Latin American countries? So, but again, even just like this cultural confusion that I don't think if you are first gen or second gen, you don't really get, right? And so I think there's all those different little nuances and starting to kind of see where you fit in, what kind of part of your cultural identity from your background you want to hold on to, what do you change? And even the clashes with your family in that, right? So if you have maybe more westernized beliefs, but your parents or your grandparents still hold to some beliefs from their country of origin, how that could really clash. And ongoing, right? Because I don't think it's just a one and done. That's kind of like an ongoing situation that could keep happening.
I really love what you said about choosing what values you want to hold on to and choosing what values aren't going to necessarily serve you in the future. I think there's... do you think that sometimes there's like a little bit of stigmatism towards more traditional values that have maybe come from your original culture, whereas actually some of those values are super powerful and can really help enhance like your whole life. And how do you work with couples to choose which values they're keeping, which they're not, and how can individuals think about that as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, so going back to your first point, I do think there's power in you identifying, like, because I think you're right? There's maybe more of a stereotype that, having maybe more westernized or individualistic cultures or values is more probably like reinforced. But really the reality is, especially, having the experience of growing up in a little bit of both, like you can still really decide and hold on to values from your culture, your background, and that's important to you and that's meaningful to you. And I think kind of reducing some of that shame that you should just let go of all these values. And again, I think that's that constant negotiation and individually negotiating what that looks like. I think with couples, it's kind of a little bit of the same thing. I think, especially couples that either come from the same culture or different cultures, it's also navigating kind of some of those tough discussions about what are our core values in a relationship, what is kind of the shared meaning in our relationship, and that there might be some differences at times. I mean, most of the time, especially if there is differences in culture, there will be, and that's okay, right? And there's kind of, John Gottman always talks about, there's like 69% of couples' problems are perpetual problems. So, and one of that is attributed to the fact that there's differences in values. And of course, that can be attributed to differences in cultures. And so kind of having that realization and normalizing that a little bit, but then as a couple, acknowledging that you guys are going to have to figure out how to have some of these conversations, and again, compromise and figuring out what are areas that you are willing to compromise and what are areas that you're not, right? And I think that's going to be a constant. It's not just a one conversation. It's going to be constantly, especially if you're thinking about parenting. There's going to be different stages of parenting, right? And how different problems that you want to navigate, and that your cultures, maybe your beliefs are a little bit different and torn. And so again, as a couple, how do you kind of come together and decide what you decide to do moving forward, still having a sense that this is what maybe 100% either of you aren't going to be like 100% on board with, but that this is ultimately what you both can be okay with.
How do couples begin to uncover some of these things?
Yeah, I mean, and I will say couples will probably start to notice that because they will start to have conflicts around it, honestly. I mean, whether it's early on or, dating stage, I think, maybe obviously as you get more committed, you will see differences, and even differences in maybe certain cultures, maybe one culture is like, well, you have to move in before you actually get married. Other people, it's like, oh, heck no, there is no way you are leaving this house unless you are married. Then you can go live with your partner. So again, you'll see that throughout your relationship. There's going to be differences in opinion and beliefs. And again, I think individually, both of you kind of having to figure out what works for you. But even, honestly, if you are dating and starting to get a little bit serious, part of that is starting to have these conversations about, what are your views on religion, parenting, having kids, relationships, roles in relationships, working in relationships, right? Is there an expectation that eventually one partner is going to stop working, or is there an expectation that both are going to, right? So there's just all these different roles to really inhabit, and you're going to start to really notice that. But if you want to be proactive, you can have conversations kind of early on, and you'll get a sense if someone's on the same page or not. Or like I said, naturally, as your relationship progresses, you're going to notice, because there's probably going to be some conflict when your beliefs and what you think are right are much different than your partner's. And again, especially if there's a cultural difference, if this is like a new issue that you're, wow, I've just never had that experience in another relationship, or I've never had this issue or thought about this issue this way in like my family because of this cultural piece that hasn't really been a factor.
We hear this from our coupley community a lot. So in coupley, you get these questions each day, right, to help you uncover some of these values and some of these things. And we were speaking to one of our couples, and they said, a big question that uncovered a lot for us was, what family traditions do we want to have regularly in our family? And it just opened... It just opened a portal into how all of these cultural things can come in, and how you can both have your cake and eat it as well. You can keep some really beautiful cultural traditions. You can have them and honor them in your relationship, but it only happens consciously, right? You actually have to talk about it, and you can't expect your partner you can't expect your partner to be telepathic.
Right, or just assume that they're going to have the same beliefs about like traditions, right? Or wanting to have shared kind of meaning about certain things. And I think a lot of times that's where people get stuck, and couples get stuck, is this assumption, well, this is just the way I view it, and so I would assume you view it the same way. And if you don't, like, not really having a lot of room for flexibility. And then again, we have the cultural piece, and then really not even thinking that maybe one way of viewing it, like that's not even a thought process that's occurred to one partner. So I love this kind of really having these open conversations about, what type of family rituals you want to have, what's important to you, what's not important to you, what's like, and tell me a little bit about what that was like for you growing up, and how can we incorporate that? I mean, this other piece, I always talk about that. At the end of the day, though, a couple, like, that's their own culture and their family. I think Esther Perel really says that, like, when you get into a relationship, you're creating your own culture there and your own community. And so, and all these stories we make, but we also have like the autonomy as a couple to kind of rewrite new stories about how we want our family to run and what we want to prioritize as important, right? And you can see that throughout, even if a couple says like, one partner says like, birthdays are really important to me because they symbolize like, time as a family, feeling special, gift giving is like important to me. It's part of my love language. Whereas someone else says like, that wasn't something that was really prioritized in my family. It just feels really meaningless. And then there's really a choice as a couple. How do you navigate that? And how do you want to move forward, right? Is there a way to kind of honor both?
And those ones normally rock up the first time as like a little bit of a surprise when you get a really rubbish gift from your partner and you're like, what is this? Why have you given me this? This is so bad.
Well, that's funny you say that, because not so long ago, I think in either individual or couple session, someone was telling me that, it's so funny, all these years I've given gifts as experiences, like, let's go on a vacation or let's take a road trip because I thought we both valued experience, and I made that assumption, and I value experience, but I also kind of really like gifts. And then just randomly, I think in a recent holiday, in a conversation with their partner after years together, their partner kind of they express oh, would you like a gift? And they're like, yeah, I actually do really love gifts too. I actually like concrete gifts, not just experiences. But there was this assumption that all this time they've been giving them experience, gifts of experience, but they'd actually prefer a material, something very concrete, but it was such an eye-opening experience that there was an assumption and you never checked the assumption. And also, again, that the partner never expressed it, right? Because I think that's the other piece. It's kind of maybe going back to your question of couples, how they can start to do that. It's also being pretty open to expressing your needs and not just maybe, keep, shutting down or getting frustrated or waiting until it gets to that point, it's boiling over, but having really open and honest conversation and expressing your needs, in a safe way where you can say, actually, no, this is really important to me, or I really do love this. And then on the other end, when your partner expresses a need, being open to hearing it, right? Because I think, of course, we're all human. And we can get really stuck when our partner expresses a need and it causes us to have a reaction. We might not be able to listen, right? Because we get stuck in our own kind of reactions and what we're hearing. So I guess that would be another way for someone to be really open about their needs and express it in a way that your partner can hear it. And for your partner, when that is happening, to actually try to receive it, right? To actually take that in.
And where I think it can get perhaps trickier with culture is because it's a little bit more sensitive. And so it feels like if someone isn't honoring your history or the way or your culture, it feels like they are in some ways not honoring your family or the people that you love and you care about. So it's quite emotional. It has quite a lot of emotions attached to it. So that I think what you're saying is that being curious or being able to receive things is the key to starting these conversations of shaping what you want your relationship to be, your relationship culture to be, and including all of the things in that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's part of it. You know, when we think of having a reaction that like our culture and our meaning behind it, like those are, again, and this comes back to your values, there's some values there that are important to you, right? So if your partner expresses something that's different than your value, it might sometimes feel like your culture, your beliefs are being attacked or minimized or invalidating, right? And so I think, excuse me, it's a little bit of both. And going back to like when the partner is expressing a need, obviously having that sensitivity in mind, right? And also that flexibility that it's not just my way or the highway, right? It's like, you know, is this a conversation we can talk about? And this is really important to me, but help me understand also like your view and what you think about this based on your culture, your beliefs, or your values. And same thing. And if you are trying to listen, kind of having that awareness that it's okay if this is something that does trigger something for you. That's normal. That's human. And is your relationship still like, can you prioritize in that moment kind of the yearning to understand and connect with your partner, right? Versus maybe an individual yearning of just wanting to be right or getting like your perspective heard, right? Because I think sometimes those are in clash too. Maybe what we need as a relationship, like and what's important and prioritizing versus maybe our individual needs, right? And then again, having to have those conversations and negotiate and navigating that. Because again, sometimes it's normal to sacrifice maybe individual priorities or needs for the relationship, not exclusively, but vice versa. And also at times saying like, hey, this individual need for me is something that I really feel like can't really maneuver around, right? So how can we make that work in a relationship?
Now, this is all great, but there is a major curveball that comes into this.
Is there now, Tim? You're saying it's not that simple? You're saying...
There is one major curveball that tends to throw everyone off kilter. We're talking about the couple. Yeah, you guys get on the same page. You'll be so great. Create your own relationship culture. But what about family expectations, community expectations, especially in cross-cultural relationships? How do you manage those? Because parents, most times you love your parents and you want to make them happy as well. And they can have a very big influence in your relationship, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that can actually be a huge barrier, again, at any stage of the relationship, right? Because even going back to that example of, let's say, you know, your culture is you don't like move in before you get married. You might be more comfortable with it, but really you can't even fathom like, you know, just, you know, the disapproval from your parents or the disrespect that they might see that as. And so it is, I think, for both parties having to really, one, understand the factor, the role that their family and their parents play, right, individually and to a certain degree in their relationship. A lot of times, though, I do, even respecting that with couples, it is also acknowledging that really having like both parties to feel like at the end of the day, they're a team, right? And so they're a team and having to figure out as a team, right, what are ways that they can navigate some of these situations, right? And again, still respecting the cultural, right? So I wouldn't say to maybe a Hispanic client, if they said like, oh, you know, my mom, like, she's really important to me, right? Like, she's, you know, she calls every day, she shows up unannounced and so forth. And, you know, maybe, you know, one view would be like, oh, you need to set very hard, like, inflexible boundaries with this mom and she can't ever kind of show up unannounced. And so maybe culturally that might be something that would be really hard because of your cultural beliefs of how you treat parents and respect. And so it might be having to navigate that a little bit on one end. It's like, okay, Are there some that maybe you could have conversations like, all right, maybe we're just like, just don't show up Monday through Friday, weekends are fair game, right? Again, and you guys navigating what that is, and your partner also understanding the meaning and implication of this, right? But still also respecting for your partner that clearly your family's role also have an impact in your relationship. And I think that's sometimes really hard when there's that cultural implication, is acknowledging that, you know, family, even if there is that cultural piece, they still might be having like a negative influence in your relationship. And again, having to learn to navigate that sometimes, or a lot of times, like you might have to figure out how you and your partner can be okay with that. Like be okay and set some limits with your family that you individually can still feel comfortable. Now, and that's the thing that I want to acknowledge. Some of these moves of maneuvering will feel uncomfortable. And I think that's a really kind of piece to acknowledge, both as a couple and, you know, when you're making some of these changes for your family, that, you know, some of these behaviors and patterns have been happening for years for an individual, right? And so even if your partner doesn't get it, and it's like, just tell your mom off. Like, what are you doing? Like, I would never let my mom show up like this, right? And there can be like, you know, some judgment, some invalidation in that.
Yeah.
And maybe not really understanding that culturally, this is something that has been really reinforced and expected. And individually, like you needing to kind of get to the point where, you know, what type of limits are you comfortable with? Because you do realize that it's having an impact on your relationship. And again, and I think it's also give and take in how receptive some of these families are to it, right?
Yeah.
Because I think that's the other piece in really acknowledging that, you know, some families are a little bit, or members in the family are going to be a little bit more amenable to change than others, right? And so I think that's the piece a lot of times when we're making some of these changes, it's acknowledging that you only have so much control, right? At the end of the day, you can't make someone do something. But in trying to navigate some of these limits that feel appropriate to you, it is continually having to say, okay, well, this is what I'm going to keep having to do. And then supporting each other in that. I think that's really key. Support. So maybe acknowledging that maybe there is a time when your partner doesn't do it perfectly. And okay, still supporting them. But also like really acknowledging and praising them and like, wow, you actually did like set a limit with your mom, or maybe you didn't answer the phone for the third time when they tried to loop you into whatever. Was like, wow, I know that was really hard for you, and like I really see that, and I appreciate that you prioritize our time together, right? So really kind of again leaning on each other as you're making those changes.
That's so powerful. That recognition of the boundary that you're building, a healthy boundary that you're building, and the acknowledgement from the partner is like, hey, this is hard, this is new, and it's probably going to be hard for your parent, community member. I think there's something really special there, because you're detaching yourself a little bit from the outcome, and you're saying, you're rewarding the behavior. Great job, we did this.
Yeah.
Is she gonna call?
Yeah.
Is she gonna call Is she still gonna come around? Probably. But you had that conversation. I think.
Yeah,
as
and
well,
I think absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think kind of like you said, it's really kind of acknowledging that you guys are like, that you're making the effort. And I want to acknowledge that. That doesn't mean that it's, again, a one and done, because that's with any of these boundaries. And I'll tell my couples and my individual clients, it's ongoing, right? So you have to continue to maneuver. So it's going to be more than one uncomfortable conversation. And again, and I always like to, though, like have this like piece of flexibility, right? And acknowledging that sometimes you're going to get it wrong, and sometimes you're going to default to old patterns, right? And again, and that's where kind of removing a little bit of that like exclusive focus on the outcome and like the process and the intention there, right? So your partner noticing like the intention in you trying and making an effort and saying like, this is really important to me, right? And hopefully, right, the goal is that if you continue to do that, hopefully eventually some of these people will start to kind of acknowledge and make some subtle shifts, right? And again, going back to having some realistic expectations of what that could look like.
It's very hard because often, actually not often, but sometimes, some people have come to North America, Canada, USA to escape terrible situations, right? So they have been through a lot of stuff themselves. Sometimes they've experienced like the most awful things, and they're raising families, but they also have their own demons that they haven't necessarily dealt with. That's the first thing.
Yeah.
The second thing is that sometimes you're working with people who are not like wholly rational actors, and they will say anything. Anything at all to get their way and use the wildest psychological tricks that you've ever witnessed.
Yeah.
You know, they will cry, they will guilt you, they will shame you. Like, what do you advise to people when they're dealing with these communication types and this sort of psychological attacks that elders don't necessarily mean to do, but that's the way that things have been done?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think even like looking at it from a lens of, for sure, even if there's any history of trauma, right? And that could be a reason, right? If you're escaping any type of persecution in your country, whatever reason, right? That you had to, leave your country of origin and come. And then again, even that, because I think of then that guilt of like your family might say, like, we left and we started from scratch for you, right? So a lot of times like that guilt that's used as well. And so whether there is like, some type of trauma or not, right? Even just a trauma of like, relocating and that cultural shock. And then ultimately, let's say there is a parent or a family member that does a lot of these kind of unhealthy behaviors, right? Manipulation, the guilt trips, the victimization, like kind of will pull out all the stops to get you to do a certain behavior. I think a lot of times I'll ask kind of really keep it in context. One, so there's this like question that Brene Brown uses. Do you think this person is doing the best they can? And so typically, if you say, no, I think they could do better. So if you say no, usually that leads to a lot of anger, resentment, and lack of boundaries. Because you keep expecting this person to change because you believe they can do better, right? So you're not setting the limits, you're not setting the boundaries, you get angry, you get frustrated, you get hurt because they could do better and they're just choosing not to. If you believe that they are doing the best they can, like this is just their best they can, that this is what they can do, and usually some of their past behaviors will tell you that, if they've continually done these similar behaviors, then you can, one, have a level of compassion and empathy. And I think that's really important, like, and even having this level of compassion and empathy and understanding that, okay, your mom or your grandma went through some horrific things, had to leave some really difficult situations, right? And so their behavior makes sense. It makes sense. I get it. 100%. And you can have all the empathy in the world and you can really kind of lean into that. And that empathy doesn't mean that you can't set limits with them if it's continually hurting you, right? Because ultimately, if I think, well, this is just the best they can do, but it's still not okay for me because I keep getting hurt, it keeps hurting my relationship or my family, then that's where I have to do some of that hard work to set limits and set limits in a way that's still compassionate and empathetic. And I think that's the piece, because I think sometimes setting limits gets a bad rap. And I think I want to definitely acknowledge that sometimes setting limits, people will say, well, I'm just setting a limit. But the way they're setting a limit is like from a very harsh, like ultimatum perspective with a lack of empathy or understanding, which usually will happen because at that point you're just so overwhelmed and this behavior has been happening for so long, right? So it is kind of really acknowledging if this is the best they can do, okay, I get it. I understand. And I can even see like the trauma, and maybe I can even see, right? Because sometimes the work is understanding your mom probably had it worse in terms of how her mom reacted or engaged with her dad, right? Like, I'm sure there wasn't any talk of feelings there. Right? And I think there is that kind of just understanding that and making sense of, yeah, they went through some trauma, and there's no kind of stopping to say like, let's like help you figure out how to move through this, or let's kind of really unpack this. And so it's like this, it is what it is, survival mode, and keep it moving. And so again, you can understand that maybe they're even a little bit better than what they were raised, but again, for you, it's no longer working. And so again, that will be that hard work in like acknowledging that even when they are pulling out all the stops, you can still find ways to set some limits and maneuver that in a way that you can control, right? So acknowledging like, hey mom, I really do hear that you would like me to do X, Y, and Z. And, kind of talked about that, when you express that, you've done all these things for me and you relocated and you started over, it makes me feel really guilty and I'm not going to engage in this behavior, right? And I totally get that this is really important to you, but it's just not something I'm willing to do. And, and again, I'm saying that very calmly, but reality is it takes work to get there. It takes work to build yourself to be in that place, knowing, and I think this is where the, like kind of the support from your partner really comes in and saying, when you hang up that call, you're going to feel guilty. You're going to question it. You're going to want to call your mom back or your grandma and just want to give in because it feels uncomfortable. Right? That's why we usually don't set limits with our, like, it feels uncomfortable. And of course, maybe you do even acknowledge the fact that, oh my gosh, they did sacrifice everything for me, so I have to give back. And so again, I think it's in those really hard moments where it feels uncomfortable, like leaning on your partner for support and saying like, I just need some help right now. I'm feeling really like, you know, my mom or my grandma, my dad is pulling out all the stops and it's really hard for me. Right. And again, acknowledging that will be a difficult period. And it is hard, especially now. I also want to acknowledge that sometimes, even if it is the best that they can do, it's still helpful to acknowledge if there's some toxic or unhealthy patterns, right? Because at least if you can have the compassion and say, okay, I get it, but also label that the behavior is unhealthy and toxic for you, then you can start to separate the behavior from the person a little bit and address the behavior without kind of demonizing the person.
Let's look into that just like a little bit more. So I'm really curious, and because sometimes you've got the you have the thing that you are in disagreement with, and then you have the manner in which the person responds to the thing that you are in disagreement with. And then the way that they respond almost becomes the new thing that you're disagreeing with, and you haven't dealt with that thing. And in fact, you start arguing about this, which even elevates it, and you still have this original disagreement which hasn't been touched. Like, what order do you do things, and how do people start to unpack all of that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's getting really clear individually, right? So again, if we're saying like, you know, your parent or family member is requesting something of you, right? And they want you to do something and you don't agree, right? And then it's also then the way they communicate it, either when you disagree, right? So then that other layer, like the guilt trip, the manipulation and so forth, and that becomes the focus. So I think it's one, having a clear sense, and a lot of times it's being proactive versus reactive. So I think that's the other piece, in knowing to a certain degree, some of these patterns have been going on for a long time, right? So you probably know some of these patterns, right? Yeah. You have a clear, and maybe if you don't, you will probably have an indication based on the fact of the continual disagreement that you're having with your partner over this, or again, the continual sense of like when you and your parent or family member get really stuck, right? So once you understand those patterns and what's not helpful in the initial behavior, right? And like what you're not on board with, I think on one end, it's knowing like, really, I just don't, not only do I don't agree with what you're asking, or I'm not willing to do what you're asking of me, then I don't like this whole secondary guilt trip and manipulation and so forth. So being proactive at some point and addressing that, right? And not waiting till it actually happens, but addressing it and saying like, and again, this is where how open is your family member and whatnot, but you don't have that level of control. What you have control over is having this conversation saying, hey, mom or dad or grandma, like when X, Y, and Z happens, like I really don't appreciate this type of behavior, right? And what I'm going to do moving forward is I'm going to make it, like I'm going to just point it out, and I'm going to say, hey, we've kind of talked about this, and either shift the conversation or disengage from this topic, right? So you've kind of already set it up a little bit beforehand. And again, and I say that, but it takes work to get to that point. Yeah. And then when the behavior is actually happening, right? And so your mom and dad asks you for X, Y, and Z, and you say, hey, listen, I'd really love to help, but I can't do that. And then the secondary behavior happens. That's where you get to reinforce that boundary, right? That's where you get to remind and say like, hey, listen, when we talked about like, you know, guilt trips, that's something like this is what I'm talking about, and this is what I'm not willing to do, right? And like I mentioned, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z.
So beautifully put.
I think that's really an important piece. So, yeah, and again, I know I'm saying this in a very smooth way. And I want to acknowledge that, like, really prepping for those bumps on the road, right? And I think that's whenever you're kind of setting some of these limits, acknowledging that there will be some bumps on the road. And that's okay, right? Because, again, that's one opportunity. You can always revisit that. And that I'm sure there's going to be multiple opportunities when this person is still going to try to engage in the same behavior. I do find, because it is, you know, sometimes acknowledging that certain people say, well, like my mom or my dad or they'll never change. Okay. Is that like, have you tested that out? Have you actually tried to set a limit before? Right. Because I think that's sometimes a common they're just never going to do that. They're never going to actually. And it's like, okay, maybe not. Right. I think going back to though, but have you really looked at your role in it? Right. And then again, if we put this back into the context of this relationship, right? Same thing. Well, my partner's never going to change their relationship with their parents or their grandparents. Okay, well, I'm wondering if we can like get again really curious about like one, what really makes it hard for your partner, and two, how are you approaching it with your partner, right? Because going back to like you said earlier, culture holds a lot of meaning and significance, and it's part of our identity. So if we feel that our partner is attacking us or criticizing us or is, you know, making us feel less than, it's not really on our team, then yeah, we probably are less likely to initiate change or try to make some like any types of limits with our extended family. So again, I always say that in a relationship, it takes two, right? Because it's a lot easier to say, well, if only you did X, Y, and Z, but it's really acknowledging that it takes two.
I was having a conversation with someone recently, and they said they had some issues in their family, and I said, well, what did this person say when you got in and talked about it? And they said, oh, no, we're not a family that talks about these things. We just get on with it. And I think there's a lot of families out there that maybe don't have these deeper conversations. And if you've never had one, it can feel absolutely terrifying before you have a deeper conversation. But I think the rewards on the other side of that discomfort are pretty incredible for the relationships, not just with your family, but with your friends, with your romantic partner, and even broader with your coworkers if you work in that sort of space. Like if you're able to have these deeper conversations. But is there anything that you can tell people to make that first step?
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right. This piece, this acknowledgement that like people, one, they acknowledge they just don't know how to do that because that's just not what was done in their family, right? We didn't do that. We just like, again, like, okay, so-and-so got mad and then we disengaged, but we just, you know, again, you just keep it moving. We never talk about it. I'm hurt, I'm bothered. We just pretend everything's okay, right? Or maybe they give me the silent treatment for a couple days and eventually they stop. So again, it's this like a lot of avoidance behaviors. And again, that might be, and I want to definitely acknowledge that, again, people do what makes sense. All behaviors make sense. And so this family's probably based on maybe their beliefs of how conflict is handled, right? Maybe they believe that really avoiding conflict is the best way to preserve the relationship, right? Or maybe that's what they're taught. You value kind of family values versus individual needs. So it doesn't really matter what you think. It just matters how it impacts the entire family. So again, acknowledging that those are all factors. I think individually, and a lot of times with clients, I will really kind of clearly spell out like, one, if this is something like, okay, this you feel bothered by X, Y, and Z that happened with your family or a friend or coworker, okay, let's kind of think about, one, what would you like to express to them, right? Like what would you like to get across to them? What would be the goal of that conversation? And getting back to like, why would that be important to you? Right. And a lot of times, obviously there's a desire for a certain outcome, right? I'd love for, them to finally just understand me, or I hear a lot, I just love for them to apologize. I just want them to like finally apologize for this thing they did. And I'm like, okay. And again, it makes sense. Of course you would want that type of reaction, but I really kind of prep clients and say, you can't guarantee that outcome. So if you can't guarantee that outcome, right? Is it still worth it? Are you still willing to go through the discomfort to have this conversation with the possibility that maybe that outcome would happen? Or is it more about just your value of starting to kind of speak up for yourself? Or your value of starting to do something really difficult in this relationship with the like hope to change this relationship, right? But knowing that you can't control that outcome, right? And so I think that's also really important. I definitely don't want people to go into these conversations that take a lot of courage and that take a lot of kind of building up to with kind of false hopes or unrealistic expectations. And when I say that, not meaning that there isn't the possibility of change, because I do believe people can change, but at least not making that the focus of it. More so like, why is this important to you? What value is here for you in approaching this conversation with your mom? And then again, if that's the case, then how can you approach it? Again, what do you have in your control to try to continue to do that, right? And so really kind of having this clear sense of that. And then when, like trying to get that willingness, like, I'm so scared to do that. Okay, then like, that makes sense. Let's kind of unpack all these fears and even fears, right? Because a lot of times people say, well, I'm just afraid that if I do that, like they're going to get so angry, right? Or I'm going to get like I'm going to get punished somehow. There's going to be a consequence, right? And okay, let's kind of work through. And also this piece of because the reality is you don't know. If there is a consequence, is that something you can tolerate? Is that something that's still important to you because it's worth it to kind of say this to your mom, your dad, your friend, your coworker, and whatnot? So again, I think there's a lot of like elements and layers to it. But I think once I find a lot of times in my experience, once you start to really break down all those different pieces, some people will say, yeah, it is still worth it to me. Other people, and let's be honest, will say, you know what though, it's not worth it for me. Like for me, what's more important is self-protection in this relationship. I'm not willing to cut off this person, but I am willing to engage in a way that I feel safer. And that's okay. And that's me, that's respecting where the client's at and their values and really how they feel they need to navigate this relationship.
I feel like what this shows up in a major way is weddings. I feel like weddings just tend to be like the ultimate contest of culture. And you have all of these stakeholders, all of which are, really invested.
Yeah. It's funny because I was thinking about that not so long ago. When I'm currently engaged, and at some point, weddings and so forth. And I think at one point, even in my own experience, I thought like, wow, I should do like a course on this because it's really not. It's just all that goes into like a wedding, like all the the financial aspect with you and your partner, and of course we know finances can be a deal breaker for a lot of people. Like all the family stuff, right? I think that's the other thing. It's you might have all this family baggage and things that both or like individually you guys have, and then at a wedding, it's like this kind of all culminates at the same time, and it's like you're like having to deal with the family dynamics. How do you set boundaries? What do you prioritize? And it's a lot. And I think there is a lot of different elements. And you're right that that's really where I think as a couple, being really clear of like turning towards each other and you guys are the team, right? Because I think in something like that, it is really easy to lose focus on what your mom wants, what your dad wants, what your second cousin wants, right? Like what these or what culturally you should be doing, right? But might be in contrast to what really your partner wants and what's important. I think I was reading this book, The Art of Gathering, by Priya. Oh, I forgot her last name, but she talks a lot about like even shifting the way like your focus and purpose of a gathering, right? And again, kind of getting really clear on like what is the purpose of this for you guys, right? So I would even say it for like an engaged couple, same thing, kind of getting really clear on that and like what are like non-negotiables and what are negotiables, and trying to keep that the focus even when all these outside factors keep trying to intervene, right? Because I think that's what happens. All these outside factors keep trying to intervene. And then again, how can you guys continue to figure out like, okay, what do we want? What do we need? What's important for us, right? Or what type of support do we need in navigating some of these difficult decisions?
Yeah, the mums tend to come out in force at weddings. This can be a day for them as well. I feel like that's something that we do see a bit. Okay, yeah. What advice would you give to people who are in a cross-cultural relationship? Because now it's sort of doubled. You've got two cultures, new to North America. Now they have double the baggage, different expectations, and that can be even more complex.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as cliche as it might sound, I really think is having that open communication top of it, right? So really having like, again, not leaving those like waiting or just assuming that your partner can know or understand what you need or want, and having really open conversations, I think especially regarding like milestones or things that are significant for you, even to a certain degree about like, what are your views on your religious beliefs, spirituality, parenting, financially, all these roles, and kind of having these open communications and understanding, again, both of you that obviously, especially if they're both first gen or second gen, that maybe they might feel like they relate more, but also acknowledging the role that their families and their culture play, and that can also cause conflict for the individual, but then can cause conflict in the relationship, right? Yeah. And that, again, it's not necessarily a deal breaker. It's because, and I always like to really say, perpetual problems are going to happen in a relationship. It's not even so much the fact that there's like a content issue about, differences on how to move forward in a parenting situation. It's the way you guys have a conversation about it, that you go from, feeling really connected and heard and on the same page to some point you guys are on opposing teams, right? And you guys are battling it out to like be heard or understood or get your point across. And so there's a breakdown there. There's a breakdown in communication. Usually that's because something is happening for you guys underneath the surface. Because of course, culture and values are a huge part of our identity. There are our stories, our narratives that we make up about ourselves. And if we feel that our partner doesn't get them or invalidates them or even like, again, demeans them, of course, we're going to have a reaction. But if we feel like, okay, there's differences, but our partner really is trying to connect and understand and is actually like the relationship is safe enough that we can have uncomfortable feelings and talk about it, but still feel like, okay, he or she has my back. Like we are on the same team, right? We're still connected and attuned. Then I think that's really the key where then you can navigate any conversation about any disagreement. But of course, knowing that, there might be more of those, right? Especially related to certain like cultural situations. So I think that's where I'm saying like having this open communication about like, okay, this is something we're just going to have, it's going to be an ongoing conversation that we're going to have in different periods of our lives, right? And that, I think eventually over time, because couples that have been together longer kind of already know, right? Yeah. You already know the stuck points, or you already know what becomes difficult, right? So you kind of, again, being a little bit more proactive and just maybe waiting till something blows up or building some resentment. It's like putting things on the table and talking about it and figuring out what a compromise looks like that really supports the relationship.
I do think as well that there is also a ton of fun to be had when you're in a cross-cultural relationship, because you learn so much about your own culture, seeing other people do things completely differently. And we're both in cross-cultural relationships. I absolutely have just had like the best time getting to be part of the Vietnamese Canadian community. It has been such a blast. The weddings are different, the parties are different, the values are different, the parenting is so different. The parenting is so different, and it is an absolute, you just see things, you almost see a different like dimension. It gives you like a really wonderful, intimate view of a whole different way of operating. And I don't know, you get double the celebrations as well, which is very fun.
And I agree. I think it's funny because so I'm first gen Colombian and my partner's Cuban. So we're both Hispanic, but even in that, there's differences in our upbringing, even how we speak Spanish. It's funny because the other day I said a word and he's like, what is that? And I was like, we've never heard this word? He's like, no, where he'll say something like saying, and I'm like, I don't know what you're saying. Like, I have no idea what you're saying, but that I agree. I think it's exciting and I think it's fun. I don't know if I'm biased because I live in South Florida and South Florida is a melting pot. And I think it's just so interesting and engaging to learn about other cultures, to be open and to be in a relationship with someone else from another culture. Yeah, it does take it's curiosity and like interesting to even see, I think even in our relationship, how we then decide again, like what we want to prioritize, right? And kind of making our own culture based on what we both think is important. So I agree. I personally think it's very fun and exciting. And I don't know, maybe I'm biased because I would say, maybe if you come, like maybe it may get a little boring if you guys have all the same shared values where it's like, maybe it's a little bit of this excitement of like learning and being interested and engaged. And honestly, I mean, I think that's where we're going to continue to go because I think, of course, with so many different cultures here in North America, I mean, even I know like most of my friends as well, like they're in like, different cultures in their relationship. And yeah, of course, there's differences, but it's also fun and exciting, or even having friends from different cultures. I think that's so great. And understanding and learning, or even when we have like a potluck, right? Like seeing all the different foods or the cultural traditions and so forth. I think that's just, it feels really connecting, actually. I think in like learning and understanding and being really curious about it.
Learning, understanding, and being curious is definitely the key to this. Because I was thinking as well, it's like, if you don't, if you don't take the time to show some like enthusiasm in your partner's culture and get involved and try the foods, do the traditions, you're missing out. You're missing out so much. Yeah,
and I didn't even think about that because I think in my head it's just innate. Like, okay, well, if you're choosing to be in a relationship with someone from a different culture, that you're also like, there's an innate quality that you're choosing to be more open and curious about. But maybe, let me clarify, maybe that's just an assumption, but I think that, yeah, there is a sense of, if that's a choice that you're making, then having, like, bringing this air of, like, curiosity and wanting to learn and respect, right? I think that's really important, respecting differences and respecting that there will be differences in your relationship, but that's okay. But maybe that's not something that is as innate, but you can foster that and you can make the effort to show up that way to your partner and like be really like open and present.
And be understanding as well when if your partner like can't quite do some of the things that are just like very, very normal in your culture. Like the first time that my girlfriend had her first full English breakfast at like 9 a.m. and she was like, wait, is this a joke? You guys are going to eat this much food at 9 a.m.? Like, what are you going to do for the rest of the day? Just recover? I was like, oh no, we drink tea for the rest of the day. There's a reason.
Yeah, no, and I love, just being open to, but I think that's such a fun experience, right? Like exposing your partner, but also being open that they also, and I think that's the other piece, right? Like being open to like, they don't have to like or enjoy everything the same way you do, right? And that can be from like traditions to certain beliefs, or even like you said, like foods, right? Or expectations of how their family is going to engage with you, right? So also being open that it's not going to always go exactly how you would like, and that's okay too, right? But just kind of being willing to go through that experience.
Yeah, exactly. And understanding that there are cultural things there. Like British people, we love to give people a hug and a kiss. That's the normal way of greeting someone. And I always I always have to remember that my girlfriend's parents aren't that physical. They're not, they're side huggers. They're side huggers. So now I know to like go and give the side hug and be respectful of those different sort of, those different ways that people interact.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, kind of being, and I think that's, again, being mindful of like maybe you're automatic just wanting to do something that maybe like that's just not automatic for your partner or your partner's family. And that's okay, right? There's ways to navigate or shift. Which may be hard, right? Because maybe like the innate is like, that's just your go-to, right? That's just what you do.
Yeah. Well, this has been such a wonderful conversation. I so appreciate you coming and joining us and spending this time with us. I'd love to hear more. What is coming up for you this year?
Yeah, so like you mentioned in the intro, so my book, Negative Thoughts Happen, How to Find Your Inner Ally When Your Inner Critic Shows Up. So that's definitely, and should be coming out in December, kind of going through the final editing stages. Very excited about that. So individuals who struggle with being highly self-critical, perfectionist, really being hard on themselves or have negative thoughts, which most of us do, like that will be a great tool to really help them. And really kind of continuing to expand and grow into, like you said, I'm really active on Instagram, TikTok. Individually, I do a lot of work with acceptance and commitment therapy, which I also kind of use with couples work as well. So doing more trainings and workshops on that. I'm really excited about that this year. And I can't even believe we're already past the first quarter because I feel like I'm like, oh my gosh, we're already like quarter one almost done. So we're really just continuing to do clinical work with my individuals and couples, which is like my main thing and my main kind of passion at this point.
Deanna, how can people reach you?
Best way to follow me on Instagram at Nurturing Minds Counseling, Instagram, YouTube, TikTok, and there you have all my contact information or my website, www.nurturingmindscounseling.com. So as long as you remember that Nurturing Minds Counseling, you'll find me in all the different avenues.
And if people have vibed with this, are you open to clients? Are you full? What's the situation?
Yeah, so I am open to individuals. I am getting a little bit full, but it just depends. Because of my license, I'm only open to clients in Florida. So that's the only kind of other caveat. So for individual or couples, I do, as long as you're located anywhere in Florida, by all means, reach out. And the best way is, again, go on my website. You can just automatically schedule consults. And then again, any other kind of resources, I do try to share as much as, resources as possible, then like the social media and so forth. And even if you are, I always tell clients, if maybe you're not in my state or in a different country, I try to see if I can help connect you with the referral. So that's always my goal. If someone's reaching out for therapy and I'm not a fit or for whatever reason, I still try to find referrals. So that's also definitely reach out. I definitely try to still help and find a referral if I think I can.
Thank you so much for being on the show. It was an absolute pleasure having you with us.
Thanks, Tim, and thanks for having me. It was so fun to have this conversation. I can have another conversation about this because, I love working with first gen couples. So hopefully it was helpful.